Lauren Westreich, I'm with Emery Hasn't stayed here, and I'm on the economic development committee, among others. That's a Wheeler resident.
Jack Asher, council.
John Sherman, resident.
Andy Getz, local businessman.
Sabrina Landreth, city manager.
I am Tim Sufer with NBS.
Deborah Offer, finance. Ronnie Hatchup with Gray-Bowen and the director of finance and operations for Emeryville team.
Liz Cardoza, Emeryville resident.
Bob Cantor, I'm the president and CEO of the Emeryville Chamber of Commerce and on the ETMA board.
So I guess I will start. Excuse me, I don't see it moving. Now it's moving, okay. So Jeff's on his way, and Maurice will be, Maurice Kaufman, who's our Public Works Director, will be joining us in a bit. And so I have a copy of the agenda. There's only a few things on it. One is just a brief update of the TMA board meeting that happened on the 1st. And I kind of wanted Jeff to be here for that. There's not really much to say other than the discussion around the Emeryville round operating budget, which we will be getting a presentation about. So if there's any other updates, we'll do that after Jeff is here. And then I have, we asked NBS Solutions to come. Tim Sufert was the original engineer for the assessment engineer, and has some, was going to give us kind of an overview of some kind of recent developments in the implementation of PBID, not necessarily changes in the law, but I would say changes in the practical ways in which PBIDs have been used a little differently than before. And so, as usual, I appreciate that when there are presentations that people focus on clarifying questions, and then we kind of discuss them at the end. Some of your questions might be answered in other presentations, and also I think these issues tend to bleed into each other, so it's kind of difficult just to have kind of a sequential discussion of the issues. I think having kind of a round robin discussion makes a lot of sense. So having said that, like I said, one of the big things at the TMA task force was a presentation of the budget. Really, in addition to that, it was mostly administrative issues, but there was an update on where they are with their budget revised for 2014, as well as projections for 2015 and 2016. And those projections are just based upon, I'm sure Ron will let you know, really just on current ridership projections. It didn't include, for example, the information that was handed out at the last meeting in terms of some of the newer developments, partly because it's a little hard to know exactly when they're going to be tenanted or tenants are going to move in. But that will be, could be a next step, and to factor that into their ridership projections and translate that into potential cost. So I'll hand it over to Ronnie, who can introduce yourself further if you like, but is with the Gray-Bowen, who is Ronnie Heck, who is staff, one of the main staff people with the TMA, and is really working kind of at the day-to-day operations and making sure that they work with the vendor. So I hand it out to you.
So does everything have a copy of?
Yeah, I got a copy.
We can just hand out. We have the staff report
And here's
the,
Jeff.
Oh, perfect. Good, perfect timing. Just hand some of these out. Take one down, please.
I'll hand these out all in the back.
And the staff report. Actually, you got this. Thank you. You want one, Ken?
Yeah.
Can you put it here?
Jen?
Sorry.
Oh, somebody's doing mine.
The staff report?
Oh, it's coming.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Oh, somebody just took my copy.
Here, hold on.
Thank you. There's more. Give it all away.
Yeah.
So I'd like to just go through kind of what I presented at the Emeryville board meeting last week. And if anybody has any questions with regards to projections on each of the line items on the detailed budget spreadsheet attached, I would be happy to answer them. So does everybody have a copy of them? Okay, so the budget projection that we have here, the 2.903, reflects what the board approved for the preliminary budget, I guess it was June of last year. And it also was given to the city council for approval to set the PBID levy for 2014. We're doing a transit analysis right now, which is being finalized, and we'll be meeting on hopefully early March to review and discuss the recommendations. But in the preliminary reports we've received, the consultant, Fair & Pierce, has recommended a 25% increase in service to the system to meet the current and projected ridership demand. Okay, so I'll continue on. This proposed budget of 2.903, it only increases operating hours for our system to 10%. So it's not expected to meet the current projections of ridership growth in this year. In the staff report, which you'll notice on page 3, we have a 3-year budget forecast. And in 2015, we projected the budget projection reflects the 25% increase, which is recommended by the Fair & Pierce study. So while 2014 budget projections don't get us quite to the 25% increase, it does take us in a step in the right direction to provide some additional operating service and one additional bus to provide some extra service. And what I mean by extra service is not service enhancements, it's simply adding a bus during peak time or times when we have overcrowding so that we can pick up those passengers that are left at the curb, which we've experienced over the past few years. The estimated cost in this proposed budget exceeds the revenue by $196,000. For these purposes, we have assumed that the excess amount would be taken out of the ETMA's cash reserve. As of the first of this year, our cash reserve was $613,000. With this budget projection of $196,000 over, it would leave us with only $417,000 at the end of the year. The reason the ETMA built up a cash reserve was we rent our bus yard, and there's been question over time as to whether or not our lease would be terminated. And we wanted to make sure we had enough money to either purchase a yard or rent a yard or move into a new place. So that's one of the reasons. Another reason was for capital equipment purchases. Over time, though, we realized that we needed this excess cash reserve to carry the ETMA through the first few months of the year when we didn't get our PBID installments in a timely manner. So we expect our PBID installments in January. We had a few years where they came in like March and April. We needed that cash reserve, and we depleted it completely at times when we didn't have the money to pay our bills. So that's one of probably the biggest purposes of holding such a heavy cash reserve right now, is so that we can make sure that we can pay our bills at the beginning of the year if the PBID funds don't come in timely. The projected cash balance, as you can see in the table, which is in the staff report on page 3, is not sufficient. I mean, the budget is not sufficient to support our estimated expenditures over the next 2 years. You'll notice in 2015, we will exceed our projected revenue by $413,000. This would essentially wipe out our entire cash reserve account, not leaving anything for the 2016 year. So we have a structural deficit problem. And I think that pretty much sums up kind of the projections. I want to say that this forecasted numbers for 2015 and 16, they're just projections. We haven't had any approvals by the ETMA board of any of these numbers. These could change slightly after we meet to discuss the transit analysis report. So we would have to define these better as time goes on, but right now this is just a slice in time, kind of what we're thinking over the next 2 years and through the end of the PBID.
And Just really to clarify again, so this doesn't include any new development coming on?
It does
line
not,
in those years?
no.
Okay.
And new development, you know, we've talked about this before, any new development would also create new ridership, so that would have to all be, you know, factored in as well. Did you have any comments?
Well, yeah, so as the board member, I've seen these already, we talked about them, I'm more familiar, but the big picture is what's important to me. So we have learned we ended 2013 with a slight deficit despite great efforts to control costs as much as possible. We did a good job and still spent $65,000 more than we had. So that's not much in the red, but it's in the red, different from, you know, it's the same deficit we've found in the last couple years after operating many, many years with a nominal surplus. I mean, that nominal surplus is how we built up this reserve. So we're in the red. This year will be deeper, just keeping people in the buses because the ridership's gone up 20% and our revenues haven't, right? So you got to carry more people, and without adding capacity buses to, you know, people are being left at the curb. So this budget's sort of saying, we're just going to meet the demand that's there. It doesn't include demand from future developments. And in general, future development is worth 25, 30 grand a pop, generally. I mean, all those apartment buildings you're seeing, a couple hundred, 150 to 200 units, are worth 25, 30 grand. That's likely not even going to carry the passengers that that project generates. It certainly isn't going to dig us out of a deficit hole, in our opinion.
Right.
So the system's suffering from success. And the Fair and Pierce report, which we haven't seen yet, but Ronnie's heard their early conclusions, is we see that ridership growing. That's why they say we think you should plan on 25% more ridership. These numbers that Ronnie's given you doesn't get to 25% because it's sort of, you know, it's sort of untenably large deficits, but it certainly makes an effort to keep the service at the same quality given more people. And that's kind of how I see it. And so you got to either bring in revenues or say, we're going to, the service will erode. Fewer people can ride the bus, or it's, you know, they ride it less often or something. That's the challenge, right? That's what this task force is tasked with dealing with. I think that's, you know, I wish it was more complicated. Maybe we could have more interesting ideas. And, you know, capital assets, the yard is a risk. I mean, we've operated for years and years and years with a 6-month cancel. It hasn't been canceled, but it is a site that someone paid a lot of money for, that's a parking lot. It won't remain a parking lot forever. I mean, we're hopeful the Emery go-round will exist long enough that that risk, you know, unfortunately will become a reality. I mean, it's in the general plan. The city is interested in not having parking lots necessarily, but higher and better sort of things that contribute to the community more than a parking lot. So that's a risk we'd saved up for, and we're spending our savings against that. And then the capital, you know, a bus, you can say, is it a capital asset, is it not? It kind of lasts 6 or 7 years. We can work hard to make them last longer, some shorter, some longer. That's not, in my mind, a real, like, one time you own it, you know, it solves a problem for a really long time, because it's part of the operating business and you have to replace them, and we run them into the ground, as we should, you know, so that's
Jeff,
my
are they thought.
leased or purchased outright? Buses.
We have a few that are leased, and we have a few that are purchased.
A mixture.
And our leases generally are lease to purchase options. We don't usually just have a real lease, but at the end of the day, our leases, the payoff is nominal, so.
You know, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, there's a cost of funds paid for that. And if if we had unlimited funds, it'd probably be prudent to buy them. But those are big lumpy expenditures, and we just can't, you know.
So where is this increase in ridership concentrated at? Is it the Hollis corridor or where?
It's actually both.
Powell.
Some of the higher density areas of overcrowding is South Hollis, starting at about the Amtrak station area and south, and Pixar along here, and also on the south portion of Shell Mound by the Marriott Bay Street area.
But also the amount of ridership on the different routes, it depends on what time of day you're talking about.
Mhm.
I mean, I think Hollis is really heavy in the morning, but Powell, once the shopping center's open, becomes heavier.
Also a little bit,
That's my
yeah,
impression
exactly, has a
anyway.
consistent ridership, there is a peak, they did notice a peak in our ridership. We took some data counts, some passenger counts. They do notice a slight peak during the peak period, a slight increase in ridership, but Powell remains consistent all day long, probably due to the shopping.
So the Fair and Piers report, we've asked for it to have that sort of stuff made easy graphically to kind of view, to absorb where are people getting on and off at what time of day. And so, you know, Ronnie's seen all this mounds of data, so she knows it better, but we will see that in that report, but.
Right.
So do they verify any of the, I know that before there was some ridership counts that were done by the bus drivers, kind of, the vendor said, we can help you out. So did Fear and Pierce do anything to kind of confirm those counts as part of their projections?
No, in order to keep our cost to do this analysis down, we actually had our operator, not the drivers, because that would have been really difficult. We had an extra person at our operator take the counts. So they were taken by all of the counts that were collected were taken by our operator.
But someone sat there and,
But someone sat there, it wasn't the driver trying to manage driving and clicking and driving and.
so there's no reason to believe those aren't accurate
Right.
counts.
So where did you get the objective or the desire or the command or whatever to say that we will meet all of the demands of ridership regardless of what the budget is?
I'm not sure we have done that.
Yeah, so so for the purposes of the 3-year projection, this committee, when we met, said we'd like those future guesses, and they are guesses. And at the time I asked, should we sort of assume a steady state, meaning we have the routes we have, we're trying to carry the people at those stops as those grow. I mean, that was just sort of a given assumption, like status quo, how do you, if you're running effectively those routes, maybe you do it a little differently, but effectively still hit all those stops. How do you let everyone get on board with the same relative frequencies? So not trying to make people able to get there faster, but not saying, you know, you're only gonna have a bus every 3 hours. That was just sort of the assumption so that people can start with that.
So that's not quite my question. My question is, let's say after the, I'm sure you're going to get a lot of information from the study and be able to bake that into your projections, excuse me. But let's say that the projection says that you're going to have a 15% increase in ridership, and you project that out to be an increase of 7% of the budget. What directive says, well, I have to increase capacity, that 15% to pick up all those people at the risk of the 7% budget? Where does that come from?
Well, we did actually try to present a budget that was less than, and that would meet only the current ridership demand. The board felt very strongly that that was not the way to go. We
That's
want to
from the
keep.
board.
So the board is ultimately, Bob and I sit on it. We just did this with our 2014 budget. You know, the board thought very long and hard, like, should we cut service to not have a deficit and protect the reserves? Because the reserves, theoretically, we built them up for bus yard and so forth, but Ronnie pointed out, any operating business, you need cash just to have a month or two of bill paying, because you don't always know your money comes in. I mean, the county collects it, this goes through the city. It's unrealistic to think you can always get money the day it's due you, so we should have money just for working capital. But the board decided to, at this moment in time, given all the focus, we're gonna just risk our reserves, risk the future, you know, sort of.
Can I take a crack at answering, Joe? I'd like to take a crack if I could, Joe. Your question is what directives do we have to provide the extra service in effect? And two things. First of all, when a building comes online, like the new building's going in now, and they're paying into it, the property owner says, I'm paying into it, regardless of whether that pay-in covers the total cost. they expect the service to be provided. That would be an answer to you. A second one is, if you look at the theory of any service provider, they're expected to provide it. An example that I always told my friend at East Bay Mud is, all these buildings going up here, they don't go to East Bay Mud to build. East Bay Mud got to supply the water. They don't say, you know, and East Bay Mud says, sorry, we just don't know, whether it's dry or not. They're a service provider. That's their job. That's our job. Our job is to provide the service, and the property is paying into it. So they market these properties as one of the many things they say, come to Emeryville, beautiful new house. In addition, you have this great free bus service to take care of part of it. So it's being marketed that way, they're paying into it that way, and if you look at the theory of service provision, we're expected to provide. So that would be my answer to you, if that's an acceptable answer.
Yeah, the marketing is the thing I want to get
Yeah,
at.
I would
That's a
probably
very
also
important
say,
thing.
Thank you, Joe.
the caveat on that, the contract between the TMA and the city, that's the basis by which the funds are channeled, do say that if revenue does not meet the budget, then the TMA has to reduce their budget to fit their revenue. So, but of course, there are reserves that they could use, you know, so there is that if, for example, the TMA said, we don't care, we're gonna increase the service 50% and run up $1 million deficit, well, their contract would provide the means of the city at that point.
Yeah, I mean,
But,
we
no,
couldn't
but that's
do
not,
that because we pay, we're not really borrowing, we don't have the ability to run a deficit like
but
that.
the board, as I said, the board's unlikely to do that because, you know, they kind of know what their revenue stream is. But just to say, there are some, you know, checks and balances, you
Yeah.
know, in terms of.
But I think the board, to try to get into their heads, I mean, Bob can speak, I think they know this discussion's going on, they're interested in this discussion, and they're saying, we're gonna bet something positive that helps the system go into the future will be worked out, so let's take this risk and operate it this way before, you know, if something goes awry, real different, you know, approach may be necessary, but.
Lauren,
Well, I mean, I'm not on the TMA board, but, you know, I've been to a lot, you know, I've been to the city council meetings, been to the meetings, I've been when these guys have presented their data. It's clear that the residents expect the service to be at a certain level too. So, you know, yes, it's very simple for the board to say, you know what, our revenues don't meet the 25% increased ridership, but trust me, at the city council meetings, everybody lines up and says, we want it.
Right.
Well,
So-
obviously,
We've had,
sure.
right, and we've had this happen also, we had in 2000, we had a surge in ridership. Before we knew it, we couldn't handle the ridership demand, and people were standing at the curb every day. We tried to do as fast as we can, implement a plan to get service to them, and the cost went up. The saving grace was having our new operator on board. Their costs were very competitive, and it saved us for a year, because had we had our previous operator, our cost would have been far, far more than this right now.
okay, so there is opportunity to have more discussion at the end. So unless there's any kind of pressing clarifying comments, there's a lot just to get through. So, okay, and I'm trying to respect everyone's time. Yes?
We have Morgan's do just a really quick
Yes.
update on the turnaround so that he can.
Okay, in terms of the in terms of the TMA meeting, one of the issues that did come up was doing an audit of the PB fund, but also kind of what the status was of the turnaround. And so, Maurice.
Okay, when this whole situation started with the turnaround, we actually did some conceptual layouts of a turnaround to see whether or not we could actually make it work. And that was done by the civil engineer who designed the sidewalk on Powell Street, since he had all the survey data there. Just for background, the original width before we built the sidewalk on Powell Street, we had a curb-to-curb width of 74 feet. And then when we, with the sidewalk that went in, it took 2 feet off that. So we had generally a 72 feet curb-to-curb, plus the bulb outs in the areas where we have the bulb outs. But generally, the curb-to-curb width is 72 feet. The new large buses that the TMA wants to use on Powell Street need a curb-to-curb width of 84 feet rolling to enable that turn. 84 foot 4 inches or something like that is what the information we got from. the TMA. What we did was we took that information, the dimensions of the bus, and all the parameters, the technical parameters of those buses, and put it into a turning radius template. And then what we were able to do is to generate a turning radius template for the buses. And there was one piece of information that was missing, which is the pitch angle of the turning radius. And so we had to be able, the pitch angle of the steering. So we had to assume that, and we were still trying to get that information from the TMA. But I believe they assumed an angle of about 40 degrees, which is typical of a bus. They were able to make a turn work with a 75-foot curb-to-curb radius. But in order to do that, you've got to do it in a certain way. Because like when you're parking your car as a parallel parking car, you've got to be at a standstill, crank your wheels, and then back in. Similar to this turn, what you'd have to do is pull up to the side of the road, near the curb, crank the steering wheel all the way over, and then you could actually make it in 75 feet instead of 84 feet. And so with that, there would be enough room to widen it. Because if you have to do it in 84 feet, we're going to be out in the bay. We're not going to be able to do it. But if we could do it in this 75-foot turning radius, we could actually widen the street by 6 feet and enable that. But so I've got a proposal for $15,000 to design it, but I'm reluctant to proceed on that unless we can actually do an experiment in the field with the bus, and whether or not the bus drivers are going to be satisfied to be. The only way they can make this turn is if they pull over to the side, stop, crank the wheel, and make the turn. A lot of times bus drivers want to do it the easy way, which is rolling, and it's a lot easier to make this. If they do it in that manner, they won't be able to make the turn. So we've got to make sure that the bus drivers, the operators, would be happy in this type of a way to make the turn with those really large buses. Or the other alternate is continue with the smaller buses. They can make the turns right now, or go out to the marina. So those are really the options.
Okay, Buzz, would you tell what your experience has been with those buses?
I ride Emeryville once a week, and coming back on the Watergate Express, I've been on the very large buses, and they make that turn right now. And the smaller buses can do it easily, but they don't. They go way out to the end and around, so I just don't understand.
Right, so this is based on the information we're getting from the TMA as far as the actual radius, and that's why I want to do this experiment, to see whether or not...
Well, they do pull into the crosswalk.
Right, which is
But
the
is
way...
that illegal?
It's not, it's the way they've been operating for years.
That's right, 19 years.
But it's,
Is that safe?
maybe Ronnie can speak
Right.
to why
Well, they're saying they can't
It's a-
do it now.
Right,
for some
it's a
reason.
safety issue. When this whole thing came about, construction started, we were alerted to the issues by many people. Many residents from Watergate were emailing, this is crazy, there's people walking, construction's happening, so we temporarily closed it down. Once the permanent construction was done, completed, and the permanent, bullet-outs were there, we evaluated the turnaround, and we could not make it in our longer buses. I was also told that we couldn't before, in some cases either. However, with all the crossing and the defined areas, it became more of a risk to the operator to enter crosswalks and then make a turnaround during a lot of pedestrian traffic out there, vehicle traffic. The risk just became higher. And their safety operations manager deemed it unsafe practice. We do have several long buses, and we have about 6 shorter buses, and our transit coaches, our big buses. Those can make the turnaround because they're made to maneuver that way. Some of our buses are on truck chassis. They're huge buses that have a fiberglass shell on them, and they don't have quite the turning radius as a transit bus would have. So, and we've been purchasing those more and more lately. So most of our fleet is longer, have the longer buses. For Watergate Express, we've designated only those that can make that turnaround for that route, only because we didn't want to increase service to that route during the peak time, and we were able to commit to 2 buses to that route. With Shellman Powell to do that, it would be an operation nightmare because we would have to commit half of our fleet to that area to make the turnaround there. And we just don't have enough buses to do that for maintenance rotation for several reasons. So we do have it happening at Watergate, and the rest of the PAL runs, unless they have a short bus, I don't wanna say short, I guess it's not really short, it's those that can make the maneuverability. Then they have to go down to the water turnaround at the marina there.
Well, what I've seen is the shorter buses do go, even though they can make it, do go there.
Yeah.
So
All the
obviously,
way out. While
obviously some of
the
this,
big buses make the turn.
yeah.
Right.
So,
And some of them might do that, because if they're on Powell, if you have some buses doing it and some buses not, your times, your frequencies get all messed up, because you have to be able to be on the same route.
Trying to keep
Keep the consistent, turn, the consistent frequency.
so what I would like to know, and I'd like to see specifically the safety report from your person and how they deem that it's dangerous to enter that crosswalk, yet it's okay to go down there and cross other crosswalks and go into the parking lot. All right, that seems counterproductive in my mind. We've had AC Transit turn there, we've had the Pacific Park Plaza double-decker
Yeah,
turn there.
yeah.
And you're telling me that your buses can't make that turn?
And they make a U-turn, those.
Yes, they
Yeah,
did.
forever.
And not a three-point turn either.
Right.
So something isn't quite jiving from what Buzz is saying, from what we've seen for 19 years. We're seeing that there isn't a lot of effort
Right.
to really do this. And I know Maurice has been pulled 2 or 3 ways on this, and I think that's unfair to the city. I think you guys need to get together and get this squared away, because we've been waiting for this for a long time.
Careful test runs as soon as possible,
Yeah.
with the city cooperating, Maurice and the city cooperating with you folks, just to see what's a safe turn there.
Yeah, we're willing to do
And
the
then make
test runs.
and then make a quick decision.
Right.
Very high on our order of things that we're interested in is to take the present system as it exists, make it efficient, make it safe, make sure that all the points are served, and of course that includes water.
Maurice, where is this turnabout located? Is it
I
west
would
of the
think
fire
Admiral-
station?
Admiral Drive.
Admiral Drive.
Admiral Drive.
Have we looked at going east of the fire station, immediately east of the fire station? And putting the turnaround there, which has the space that's part of the east
Just in
shore
front of the
state
fire
park?
station, there was reluctance on the fire department's behalf. They didn't want to have a turnaround happening potentially at the same time as
Competing,
an
yeah.
emergency. So they didn't really, we didn't think that would be a wise place to do it.
If it were east of
There was
there though?
Well, you're thinking, what I'm understanding is in front of the Watergate Market, where you could maybe serve
Yeah.
that stop and then do the U-turn right there?
Yeah.
Right, that would be right in front of the fire station, which would be a little bit problematic for that.
It would also create problems for older people. It's already too far to walk for some of them.
Well,
We need the corridor.
I think that's where we get into policy issues, which is a whole other thing. It's like, what is a reasonable amount, distance for people to walk? A 5-minute walk. I think in our sustainable transportation plan, I think we kind of looked at that as being the distance. And I'm not here to argue whether that's right or wrong, but I'm just saying I think that's a policy issue that needs to be addressed, is what is reasonable for people who walk. And if we're shortening the distance, but we're making a transit system that doesn't function very well, I think we need to evaluate that.
But the point on that is that the captain and the Commodore drives are off the boat, off the drawing board, because you have fire and police that are against it. So it's not gonna happen there. So the Admiral or the Anchor are the 2 spots that are appropriate.
So my other question is, are we involving AC Transit in this?
They don't serve the peninsula right now.
But I think we need to plan for the future. I really think that AC Transit is part of our
I think when
overall-
typically when AC Transit was serving the peninsula, they wanted to go all the way out to the end.
Yes.
And they would actually make that a layover. We actually built a bus pad all the way out at the end of the marina, and that was the rest. They would stay there for half an hour, and then they would start to run again.
It's a nice place to rest.
It's better than in front of my building like they do now.
And we pay $90 per resident for AC Transit.
I think that is a good point, though, John.
And I just want to make one point with regards to the turnaround. I mean, the longer buses that we have, or the ones that can't make the turn, when they are going to that Watergate Marina, they're not backing up the bus. That's where it becomes a problem. So when we were making those 3-point turns, when they were reversing into traffic, that's when it became a bigger risk. And making a turnaround going forward is noted as a safer practice per the operations safety manager. They did write us a little explanation from their safety guidelines as to the 3-point turn issue. So with regards to the marina, it's not a 3-point turn. They're not backing the bus up and maneuvering in that way.
So it's the 3-point turn issue is really the issue.
That is the issue. Yeah, we cannot make, in that area, we would have to make a 3-point turn in order to.
Unless you go to the crosswalk.
Unless we go into the crosswalk, and I don't even know if that would work in some
Oh, it
of our
does work.
big-
I mean, we've seen it. I mean, dozens of times. It's not a problem.
Well, it works in some of the, like I said, we have half of our fleet that can make the turn and half that can't.
I
But
can't,
they
I
make
can't.
it.
Everybody, it
Not.
seems that,
Right.
that the action item
Test.
is that the city and the TMA
Test.
Right.
staff
test.
will do a
Yeah.
test.
Yeah.
And
And
based
also
upon that
please-
test, we'll have more information.
Test.
Please pass the information to
Yes.
AC Transit as well.
Right.
Those two things.
So we'll stage that. We'll have to
Yeah.
eliminate parking along that side of the street for
It's all right.
the morning that we're doing it, I guess.
Yeah.
Or, you know, however we decide to do it.
Mhm. Just let me know when you guys are ready.
Do that.
Great.
So, last time, I think it was, we only haven't met that many times, but anyway, we did have a discussion about some recent changes in PBID law. But after the fact, we actually met with NBS, and they actually have even newer information that's not so much based upon the change in the law, though he will talk about that, but about some recent changes in how PBID have been implemented that were not something that we were aware of, which I think may be very pertinent to this task force discussion. So this is Tim Super. He's a managing, I mean, you weren't any of that when we first met. You're now a managing director.
For an intern.
We actually found a flyer with him 20 years ago. When he was like a junior staffer or something.
Well, good morning, everybody. I just wanted to give kind of a little brief overview of things going on with the law and sort of practices and that kind of thing. But just to back up, just make sure everybody's on the same page. We're talking about the PBID law, which is the 94 Act, right? Which allows what you've been doing for many years here is to assess property for special benefit to provide these services. And the PBID does everything from clean and safe to marketing, economic development. You go to Union Square in San Francisco, they have the guides running around. This doing transit is actually, as far as I know, it's the only one in California. There is one in Denver, and there's some other places that do, but so it's a unique thing. I've always found it very interesting to talk about with people, and a lot of folks have looked at it, but they've never actually pulled the trigger, if you will, in other cities. So anyways, so it's a 94 Act. One of the things that people don't know of, well, there's an 89 Act, which is business-based assessments. So in other words, not property, but actually on business licenses. But the 94 Act, the one that we're using right now, allows you to do property or business or both. So just kind of something to think about in the future, and I'll talk about some in a minute. So that's the law that we're using, the enabling statute, if you will. It's the same one that San Francisco uses for all the CBDs over there, community benefit districts. To renew at this point, you can renew for up to 10 years is the standard. So if we started today, you can renew for 10 more years. Generally, I recommend about a year process to do renewal. Some of you have been here a long time, right? Recall we formed this thing in months, and I would never recommend that again. You really need time to go through things, and one of the developments that Karen was alluding to is that the procedures and the legal rigor on these districts has definitely elevated in the last 5 years, quite a bit. In some respects, assessments have been on the ropes a little bit with the courts. We're still forming assessment districts all over, but instead of report this thick, it's this thick. You have a lot more objective data, a lot more analysis, unfortunately, goes into these these things. So that's probably the first thing, is that, legal rigor is difficult. And I'm not a lawyer, but basically Prop 218, which was passed some years ago, is a constitutional thing. So that's why the courts are looking at it more carefully than they used to be back in the good old days, if you will. So that's important. There were a couple of P-bids overturned in Los Angeles, if you read the papers, so for various legal reasons. So again, that's all part of the legal rigor. The other is, one thing I do want to mention is, it's not uncommon now to assess residential property. And again, you see that a lot in San Francisco, you're seeing it in certain places in LA and even in Oakland here. It used to be thought you'd never assess residential. If you're providing security services that go right down the street, how can you distinguish between a business type property and a residential if they're both getting services from security, for example, right? It's kind of the typical example I use. Bonding is allowed, and it's actually been allowed for a few years. It's actually called out in the statute, where in other words, you could issue a $1 million bond and use your assessments to pay back that bond. Obviously, if you've already got a little bit of a deficit, you don't have a lot of extra cash flow around to bond against, right? But it is called out. Smart financial advisors and underwriters have always been able to figure out a way to bond against any stream of money. But if you do use the code, which allows 1915 Act bonds and Mark Truce bonds, if you're into some of the terminology there, you could actually increase the length of your district. Remember I talked about a 10-year renewal? If you had to do a 20-year bond, you can actually do a 20-year renewal. These laws were put on the books. They really haven't been used much at all. They were put on the books for Sacramento when they were trying to redo the Arco Stadium or whatever a few years ago. And it actually never worked politically, and you probably watched some of the other stuff that's gone on out there, so it's been interesting. One legal thing, just recently there was Senate Bill 184, which made some really minor changes to the language, but it took out this weird line that was in there about a categorical exemption. Property that was otherwise not accessible could be just exempted. It doesn't make any sense. If you've got, a public building, again, that's getting all that security services, you can't just exempt them. Anybody who gets services or benefit has to be assessed. Kind of comes back to that, that residential discussion that we were talking about. So, long story short is, given that you've got, a deficit, a looming issue going on, I would say, renew sooner than later. If you start today, in theory, you could have new assessments in a year. Renew for 10 years, unless there's consideration of bonding to, buy property or buy buses or something like that. One of the things I mentioned a minute ago to consider, and again, there's many ways to slice this, but if you renewed at your, $2.7, $2.8 million, but you wanted to get an extra few $100,000 and you wanted to have that targeted to certain areas, maybe you layer in a business-based assessment as well. And I know this is a political discussion that we'll have to have a lot of talk about, but that's an idea, to layer on that, and maybe, Bay Street, is a little zone and they want a certain service, so, they pay a little bit extra, or whatever it might be. That's something to consider. There are parcel tax type mechanisms, CFDs, but those are, those have different voting requirements and things, but that could be an option to just do a certain special tax on business only, not residential. There's some voting requirements there that are kind of weird. And then, you're already kind of doing this, but contract for services as well. Let's say, again, I'm picking on Bay Street, but let's say, Bay Street people say they want this service and they want it every year for the next 5 years, and they're willing to sign a contract. That's outside of the assessment. So you get $100,000 a year from them over and above because they want, this bell or whistle or whatever. So that would go, outside of that, obviously. The reason I mention it is the flexibility. Once we lock down an assessment formula, and everybody renews for 10 years, that's it. We're not changing that formula for 10 years without a vote. You can't just go in and change things 2 years into it without having to go completely back out and ballot the property owners and go through all that process. I guess the only thing I was gonna mention is for the renewal, again, this is procedural stuff, we have to go through, you know, of the ballot proceeding again, and it's a 50% plus one, in theory, protest ballot, right? So ballots are mailed to the property owners, and you wait to see what ballots get returned. You don't have to have 50% of what you send out, you know, to get approved. So if you mail out 100 ballots and you get 3 back, and 2 say yes, you're good. If 2 say no, you cannot proceed with the renewal.
But real quick, Tim, but it's weighted.
It's weighted, yeah, I'm simplifying, but yeah, it is weighted, so yeah, by dollar amount. So yeah, $1, 1 vote, you know, if you will, versus 1 person, 1 vote. So I think I covered most of the sort of highlights, if you will, just as an update, but.
I think there's probably questions here, there's maybe some things that people here don't, I might put out there based on our discussion, but Laura.
So if you do a contract on top of the P-bid, they're still required to pay the P-bid assessment, they just pay extra for extra service, right?
Correct, yeah. Because once you make these findings of the special benefit to the properties, then they're locked into that.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So if I can, there has been, one of the issues has been sort of this, some groups of businesses feel that they're not getting as much benefit from the P-bid as some of the larger. Would you recommend doing the contract or changing the basic assessments for each of the businesses?
We could look at both. You know, unfortunately, these things have become like the tax code, right? And
Yeah.
there's a lot of maneuvering and winners and losers and all that kind of stuff. But you could look at maybe some zones. You know, I think everybody likes to keep it simple.
Right.
And I would definitely advocate for that, but you might have a couple of zones, like again, Bay Street, you know, maybe that the concentration of businesses, you know, maybe there's a reason why they get, you know, a penny more per square foot than, you know, along San Pablo, or, you know, whatever it might be.
Yeah, and that's.
Yes.
There has been some discussion about a prohibition against adjusting any assessment formula during the term of an approved P-bid. Because you're locked into a fixed assessment for fixed properties over a fixed period of time. But conditions change, and the routes and needs will grow and shrink in different parts of the city. Is there any possibility of changing assessments as buildings change use, as buildings are built, as those sorts of things happen during the term of a district?
Well, you, without sounding too technical, basically you approve a maximum assessment, and it's X cents per square foot. So if you add 100,000 square feet on a piece of empty property, then by definition their assessment will go up, right? But you
Related
can't,
to a change of use, but not changing the district?
it's because of, yeah, the property owners, you know, voluntary change in their property to increase their square
So it's a
footage.
condition of approval for a development that is a hook?
It's not really a condition of approval. I mean, it's, if you build it, it's there, you know what I mean?
So it automatically changes?
It's, when we formed the assessment, it was on every property in Emeryville, right? So if you had a vacant lot that you build a building on, then therefore your assessment is
Or
going
if
to
you
go
had a
up.
warehouse and then you turned it into office space, that's a change in land use.
So it's self-executing?
Once a year, we evaluate the different parcels and develop the levy. And so once a year, we assess, is there a new floor put on that building? And therefore, there would be additional assessment to that property owner. Or is, you know, has something been torn down, then that wouldn't be assessed anymore. Once a year, that analysis is
I
done.
think
Yeah, so
one
there
of
are
the
those
things-
annual, go ahead.
One of the things he's probably interested in, does the assessment ever go down during the summer?
Oh, I think you just answered.
For example, when Sherwin-Williams is demolished, there will be nothing to assess on that site.
So it works both ways.
So you can go up to these maximums, you just can't change the maximum. I wasn't sure if that was your question. If it's 10 cents a square foot for the next 10 years, then it's 10 cents, you can't go over.
But it changes from 10 cents a square foot if you build on a vacant lot, doesn't it?
Well, So if your vacant lot then has 100,000 square feet on it, then you're paying the 10 cents on the 100,000.
You don't have different rates for different uses?
They do, warehouse,
some, yeah.
industrial, yeah.
Vacant lots a different use from an office building.
Correct.
So
But
if you
vacant
build
use
an
is
office
zero.
building, do you automatically get to tax or assess that property as an office building?
Yes, you do.
Yes, on the
It's a
next
chain.
round.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes.
Because it's on structural square foot, so a vacant lot has 0 structural square foot. So the assessment is there's a lien on the property, but the assessment is 0. As soon as you build on that vacant lot, it's based upon the land use that the structural square foot that you built. So if you built a warehouse, it would be assessed at the warehouse rate. If you built an office or retail, it would be assessed at that rate.
I think there are 3
There's
classifications, right? There's commercial, industrial, and residential, I believe.
Yes.
And that
No,
depends.
there are 3.
Okay. So Karen's example of the warehouse to an office would be a good example. That'd be from an industrial to a commercial use, and there is a different rate for that.
And it would double, and assuming the same square footage, that would double the rate, because warehouse industrial in the current P-bid is established at half of what the commercial retail rate is.
So I think everybody here wants to make sure that we have fairness built into the PBID process. And I think with what you brought in, we can add a little layer of fairness that's going to help out.
Well, yeah,
Long-term
fairness, equity,
stability.
Yes.
and objective
Good.
criteria.
Predictability.
That's really,
So if you include
Stability
residential, you would
comes
just
from-
send it out to literally all of the parcels in Emeryville, everybody within a certain distance from the Emery property.
if that's what makes sense, then yeah, that's
And
what
then
we do.
it would be a mail-in vote, the same thing, it would be done exactly the same way, except it would just include different additional parcels.
Well, except for those that are in rental housing, it's still it's the property, under a PBID, it's the property owner who gets the bill.
Right.
Or I suppose you could layer in the business license. So a resident in a rental property would not be voting on this. It would be, either
Their
the
business,
property
yeah.
owner as the parcel owner, or the property owner because they're the one paying a landlord business license, right?
But people in
And
condos or individual
condos
homes
would be getting, right,
eligible.
they would each get a ballot, so to speak, in which it would say, based upon whatever criteria, it could be per unit, it could be per bedrooms, it could be per square foot. Obviously, some of those are a little bit more straightforward and easy than others to do. And, that's obviously as much of a political question as it is a objective engineering question on, how do you determine that? I mean, right now, it's the same per unit regardless of anything else.
It's just a unit cost.
It's just a unit cost. And there's reasons that, I think, your experience is that that's oftentimes the case, that once you start getting more complicated than that, then
Is it an enforceability problem? If you go bedroom hook rather than unit hook, is that the problem? It's unenforceable because you don't know what they are?
No, we do know what it is. Every structure is listed by bedroom in the planning department.
I mean,
There's an
theoretically, there
administrative
could be
issue,
more.
let's be honest.
Yeah.
It's hard to administer it now,
Too much headache.
right?
That's a
Let's
good
be honest.
argument.
So making it more complicated won't make it easier to administer.
Yeah.
You wanna have equity that's administrable,
Yeah.
You don't want 10 million people saying you've built me wrong,
Yeah, no, I don't.
or 8,000, or I don't know. But
any other questions?
Helpful.
I had a question. You recommend starting a year in advance, but you made it also sound like you could put in a new program earlier than the expiry of the existing, or not?
No, I don't know, I hope I didn't.
Okay,
I
maybe
think you could do contract for services, I mean, you can do that, right? as soon as
Well, we're
you
already
finish
doing
it.
that.
Yeah,
So, but this expires calendar year end 16, right? So you say the earlier, there's nothing we could start it now, or we could start it, in your mind, would be a mistake to start it any later than the end of this year. I mean, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
right.
the end of this year.
So
I mean, the sooner the better, especially with the deficit and some of these questions, it seems like put it all on the table and.
So the question would be, so right now, the current P-bid, the last assessment is fiscal year 15-16. which is service year 16. So the last time would be put on the property rolls as fiscal year 15, 16. Right now, we're in 13, 14, so we've kind of 2 more years of assessment and kind of 2.5 more years of service is the way to look at it, because I won't get into why, but
Yeah, we
it was
understand.
structured so that you could get through a whole calendar
Yeah.
year, even if the PD ended. And so I guess what I was hearing as part of Jeff's question was that if you, let's say, are going out to the voters next year, or putting it on the ballot for next year, that would be during fiscal year potentially 14, 15. And so what would happen in terms of, would it have to be an effective date out? I mean, where would be the effective date of the renewal if you go out, let's say, next year, as opposed to going out in the middle of 15, 16?
I don't think there's any legal reason why you can't, renew earlier. And if you get approval with another assessment that's earning $3 million a year, for example, I think you kick that in as soon as you could. So in other words, we would not do the final year assessment with the old, we would roll the new in. I think that would probably make sense. I mean, especially again with the deficit and such, and getting ahead of that, you don't want to run out of cash reserves, so.
So that's just technically, I mean, I don't know, but, so it could be that fiscal, under the old one, 15, 16 could be 0.
Correct.
And then, but then under the new,
It
you
would
would.
start 15.
The 15, 16.
Yeah, the council has the, opportunity to levy the assessment or not, so they could just say, all right, the old one is done and the new one is here.
Can the contracts that you mentioned for specific zones like Bay Street or something like that, can they be instituted on the current P-bid, or do you have to have that structure in the new P-bid?
As my understanding, I mean, it's a contract for services, you can do whatever you want today. I mean, I don't see any reason to hold that back. You'd still levy the assessments. This would be something that would be layered on top, that would be voluntary. It's got to work for them, so.
So that's another option.
I mean, right now, the TMA does contract with West Berkeley to administer their shuttle.
Well, no, what I was talking about, and maybe I used the wrong terms, you talked about zones of P-bid that you could have more flexibility in
Well, if we want to create new zones with different assessments, that would be through the renewal process, yeah.
All right.
If you just want to do a contract, a side contract, if you will, then you could certainly do that anytime.
And the contract for the P-bid assessment, not for...
No, for example, there was a time when, like, the evening service, the later night service first started. At first, it was 1 or 2 businesses saying, we're high-tech, our folks are working until 9, we need night service. And so there was a contract to provide night service. It didn't stop everywhere, it just stopped at 1 or 2 buildings, and they paid a premium, so they contracted for that service. And then after a while, particularly as there was more high-tech in Emeryville, the TMA board said that between regional retail, between many more office space or research space with later hours, it made sense to add that night service, so to speak, throughout the system. But it first started with a contract.
So isn't that the same thing with weekend service? I mean, couldn't that be sort of a contract, weekend service? I mean, that would address some of the things that the EPOA was talking about, I think, right? In other words, not all businesses are open on weekends.
I think that's something for discussion. I think that some of that might be better addressed in the renewal, because then you start picking apart, well, if I'm retail, maybe I get weekend service, but I don't get much service between 6 and 10.
Yeah.
I mean, so I think I don't know if opening that up now, as opposed to that being part of the discussion for the newer one, I think would probably make more sense, because I think
I agree with that.
There's quote, people get more or less benefit during the day, just on the type of business that they are.
Well, we talked about that when we get the new study from here in Paris, that, to my mind, it doesn't make sense linking commercial and retail. I think they're very different beasts. So, but we won't know until we get the information from the study.
And one of the things I think is important is you want equity, but you don't want to create a system that discourages adoption,
Correct.
right? Like, I believe in general, this is a great transit addition, right? And we want to encourage ridership, not discourage it,
Yeah.
right? Because that's the problem with success. So you don't want to say, this neighborhood isn't using it now, so we're not going to serve it, and then they won't use it because there isn't the service. So that's why the board has sort of wanted to reinvest in the service, because it, you know, once passengers opt out,
You don't get them back.
it's much harder to get them back because they just figure out a different way of traveling whatever that trip that they're taking is, so.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense to reduce service to meet your budget because you run into that.
But for example, as Lauren moves her business to West Oakland, if she could rally businesses to fund a service in West Oakland and they signed a contract, because that's exactly kind of, West Berkeley was similar to that, you know? So
Yeah.
those are really good freestanding, because it's someone who doesn't have it who says, I really want it.
Yeah.
The people who have it, it's hard to say, other than little exploratory
Yeah,
things
I
like Karen
agree.
mentioned, which people have encouraged the Emery go-round to experiment. Like, we think their riders, it was the same with the car share. I mean, the Emery go-round subsidized car share to come to Emeryville, saying to the car share, we think there's a business here, and we're confident you'll find that there's a business that doesn't need a subsidy. We'll subsidize you long enough for you to figure that out. And they figured it out really quickly, you know? So that was another case of wasn't so much as a contract, because the TMA said we want to, and now they're running the business unsubsidized, other than people are giving them free parking, which is also a subsidy.
Right.
And that may fall away, but it's that kind of thing that you want, I think, to continue into the future.
But nothing's free. Somebody's paying for it.
Okay, so anything on any of these other issues?
Question for you on, is the quality of the buses, are we looking at improving the quality of buses, some more, less of the truck body?
You know, we did look at trying to purchase some transit coaches. We have 3 right now, actually. We purchased a few Eldorados, which are more maneuverable on our routes and whatnot, but they are problematic because their parts come from Canada. So a transit coach versus the cutaway, which is what we call those fiberglass buses on the truck chassis, the cost difference is huge. From
They're like
about
3X,
300,
right?
yeah, 300 to 400,000 to 100,000.
For
So
which is
the cutaway is about 130,000, and the transit coach is about 400,000. So in order to start building into our fleet these more transit coaches, it would be a beautiful thing. I mean, access to the wheelchair access boardings would be so much smoother. Everything would be better with
Turnarounds
transit.
are easier.
Everything, the turnarounds are easier, and maneuverability.
Durability?
Durability, they last longer than the cutaways.
But they don't last, we looked hard, they don't last longer enough to
right.
justify the cost.
Exactly.
Four times,
We're
right?
environmentally-
Exactly.
Jack, to answer John's question, John, a broad thing, sure, look, we always look at that on the board. You ride an AC transit bus today, it's not the same bus you rode 20 years ago, they upgrade. Board upgrades its cars. We're always looking to upgrade to the extent we can afford it, of course. We're always looking at that. It's very expensive.
Yeah, and
We tried.
that's ultimately, I think, my question is like, how expensive is that? Because I think in the long run, the overall big picture, we need to look at the quality of our transportation in Emeryville. It goes beyond the Emery-go-round, and it's like, how do we up the quality of our transportation? And it has to be one of the aspects of this study that we have to identify.
But then it's a question of balancing, like, you know, if you buy a bus
Sure.
that's 4 times the cost of another bus, then you have to change service somewhere else because you can't afford
Right.
the.
Exactly.
It's a trade-off.
I think in general, I think the board has said, we're a short trip system, not long. And mostly we want to, I mean, they're not ugly, they're not dirty, they're, you know, they get you there in reasonable comfort and they've gotten better over time, but mostly it's, we got to carry maximum bodies at maximum frequency.
Which I think are doing a great job.
Right, I mean, they
Purpose.
work, but they just
Yeah.
aren't built for
Yeah.
a bus system. They're not built to stop and go every few, minutes, and, it wears them down a lot faster. I mean, we really can't get more than 10 years out of our buses, and we start looking at replacement around 7 years, so. But still, we did look at the cost over time. Would it be better to invest in the more expensive transit coaches? It just didn't pan out, and we financially just could not do that.
It's a higher threshold to purchase them, and they don't last 3 or 4 times as long.
Exactly.
40 years.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe you'll get an extra 5 years out of them than you would.
Okay, so next steps.
Well, I have a little list of things. I'm not wedded to anything on the list, but let me just throw these items out as a way to go forward. We all agree that the system is invaluable. We want to keep it going. We want to keep the service level, at least at present level, and expand appropriately for the future. We want to fix the Watergate turnaround, and the idea of testing and getting that sorted out quickly appeals to, especially to all of us who live out there at Watergate. And we want to coordinate, John, our Emeryville services adroitly with AC Transit to the degree that we can. There's no question about that. So what are the tactics for dealing with the operating deficit that's current and looks like it's going to be for the future, and for appropriate capital spending? I have a little list of things there, and you folks can add to it and fuss with it. I have no particular pride of ownership here. We should look very carefully at upping our transit occupancy tax 2%, make us competitive, comparable to Oakland and Berkeley, and that might generate, and specify that increase in transit occupancy tax be devoted to the support for the Emeryville. That would require a ballot measure, but it's really worth taking a close look at and thinking about. I'm not quite sure what that would generate. I know, Karen, you pointed out that would fluctuate depending on the flow of the business in the hotels. But
Yeah, I thought you said
About 450.
300 to 450, depending, $300 to $450,000 a year, depending on the year.
About 400,000, I would say.
Yeah.
about 400,000, which would go a long way towards solving
per
problems.
year.
So that's per year.
Per year.
By percentage point, I think it was.
No, I think that was total.
Or was that for 2?
Right.
Yeah.
I would use 400, just to.
So let's keep our eye on that as a possibility for sure. We should make a carefully considered and carefully crafted bid to Alameda County for support for our Emeryville system. As we know, they've done a budget transfer so that the pool for shuttle services such as ours is larger potentially than it's been in the past. And we should go particularly, and Karen, I'm really picking your brains on this, don't go for operating costs,
No.
but go for capital investment.
Right.
Leasing.
Rolling stock.
Rolling stock, and the bus shelter. Those are the kinds of things we ought to go hand in hand, but with good argument, to Alameda County for. That would be a good idea. We need to continue to work on assessment fairness, engineers, operations, and so forth. That might take some of the sting out of the complaints coming from some, like the North Halls business people. I know we'll never satisfy Francis Collins, but we do want to make sure that our assessment system is as fair as we can possibly make it. I put down here, hit the big 7 for contribution boosts. I know that some of the big 7 pay an enormous amount. Jeff would remind me, for example, of the size of Warehams' contribution to Emeryville Round Services.
We're paying about $340,000, $350,000.
Which is by far and away the biggest from the original group that got together to put this together. Pixar could pay more, Bay Speed could pay more. Perhaps this is a matter of special assessment or special service adjustments, but in any case, we ought to take a look at that. Since I'm a resident member and chair of the Finance Advisory Committee, always try to spare the general fund if you can. Try to find your source increases. In post-redevelopment agency era, trying to find money for capital improvement projects and so forth. That is from general funding. We don't want to tax that process excessively. We want to spare the general fund. On the other hand, it's there as a source of last resort to help something as valuable perhaps as the Emeryville. And finally, as Joe pointed out to me, can the school district make a contribution to supporting the Emeryville? And I have no real information on that. Well, there's a core of ideas. I know you folks have other ideas that you would like to throw into the pot. But there are things we might keep thinking about as a task force to recommend to the city council.
So, one of the questions that I have is that this is a staff level task force, so what we're really asking is kind of your input and to kind of, to some degree, your reaction to, you know, certain concepts. So that when staff does go to council, you know, what staff is bringing to council is something that, you know, kind of acknowledges kind of what a good cross-section of the community has kind of said is something that we think how we should go forward. So one of the questions in terms of the PBID renewal I would have as a question, is what is the thought of those here about if with some further research, there is comfort in believing that residents could be included into the PBID, what's the reaction of this group to that?
I'll mention that right away. And as I've said, and I consistently said, the Emery-Go-Round was built mainly on mitigations for traffic, noise, pollution, etc., and parking from the businesses. And it's pretty obvious that, you know, when businesses are open, that the streets of Emeryville are almost impassable. So most of this traffic is business oriented. It was developed for the mitigations and as a reward to the residents at that time when it was developed. That's the first thing. So for us to have to pay for our own mitigations to me is ridiculous. Additionally, many of people who are outside of Emeryville, who are traveling into Emeryville and using the Emery-Go-Round, we will be subsidizing people who don't live in the city to use the Emery-Go-Round. The residents that live in the city will be subsidizing out of city residents to use the Emery-Go-Round. I don't think that's acceptable.
Well, as a business owner and not a resident, I take a little bit of exception with that. First of all, the population has doubled since this was initially, more than doubled. And when people, to address your last point, when people from outside the city come here, they spend money in Emeryville, not always, but for the most part. It's a possibility that they're coming and they're spending money. They're not just coming to ride the Emery-Go-Round to MacArthur Bar.
But they're spending money at the businesses.
Right, but the businesses already fund 85% of the general fund, okay? So I think that with the PBID, it's still property-based. So if you're not in the special assessment zone, you wouldn't be levied any taxes. It's not a sales tax, it's not regressive, it's part, and there's no reason that a resident should be paying the same per square foot as a business, because the business square foot use is certainly higher than a residential square foot use. But I think across the board, saying the residents get this for free is not appropriate.
Well, and let me just qualify that. I'm talking about the exempted residents, the Watergate and PPP is exempted and Emery Bay is exempted because they are homeowners associations. And in Watergate, you have maybe a 3 to 5% utilization of the Emery-Go-Round. To expect, which is probably about the number, the percentage that they use the school, maybe a little less. So to expect that 95 to 98% of the people to pay for not using this is regressive. particularly to the people who are on fixed incomes and everything else, who are paying assessments that they're not getting any value out of it. So from that perspective, I stand by what I said. For the residents who are now in the Hollis area and in some of these other areas where they are in a high use area, that's already happening. The city is already having assessments for existing rentals and et cetera. So, but for the existing Watergate, PPP, and I would disagree.
Well, we already know legally you can't do a categorical exemption, that's not allowed anymore, so.
So my feeling on that, to answer your question, is I certainly don't represent PPP, but I live there, and it's a service that I'm being provided. I'd be happy to pay for it. But at the same time, I want quality for what I'm going to be paying in. And if I'm going to pay in, then my expectation is that if I'm trying to get from PPP to MacArthur BART, I'm not going to go out to Watergate, and extend my trip a little bit further. And I also wanted to kind of address something that you said. 3% of Watergate may be riding the bus, but it sounds like, wow, they certainly have a lot of political clout as to impacting the operation of the bus system here. And for me, it has degraded my service for the route changes that they have to do. And I think that has to be thrown into the mix of things too.
That's a Gray-Bowen issue that they made a unilateral decision about something. Number one. Number two, you've got to remember, those stops are serving the Watergate Market and Trader Vic's. They are TMA paying members, so that's who they're serving.
Well,
Jeff?
One of the challenges is equity, because there's this whole task force, there was a whole group of people that, maybe it was small, they were very vocal and said, we don't think there's adequate equity, right? That's how this started in my mind. So you want to have equity, and so some residents are paying and some aren't. Maybe there's a way, Joe, to deal with that. I don't know the answer, but when you start saying this person is treated differently than this person, you get the opportunity for people to be anxious about it. And as it goes forward, and let's say there's a 10-year PBID, 30 years from now, probably Watergate's filled with all new people. So I get what you're saying, like we were here and we let something happen and we deserve a payback for it. But does that go for someone who moves in today at Watergate? If we can answer those things in a way that everyone felt comfortable, I'd feel better about it going into the future, because I'm trying to think, who's going to complain in 5 or 7 or 9 years, right? Because I envision this wanting to run 10 years from now, right? I don't, so I don't know the answer to it, but having exclusive classes it sounds like you want to not have that feeling so that most people are on board, but that doesn't, I'm not saying that it means everyone should pay, but having an answer to that would be helpful.
Well, and then if that's the case, then the schools have to be included in that very thing.
I'm all for that.
Yeah, but they're not paid.
Here's two things. If you include the schools, you're just taxing yourself. It's a totally tax-funded operation. It's just you're taking your own money back to pay for something else. You're moving it around. They are not generating funds out of the school. And when we move into the ECCL, the city is going to have to cover that. Because what are you going to say? Let's not have a computer science teacher because we need to pay for the PBID. That's not going to work. And so when we finally get in the same facility, we will be covering it because it will be a public building, and that but to imagine that we can go back and that there's some resource that we haven't tapped, it's just your money.
Well,
right. And then also the other thing I'll say is that once you start thinking about opening it up and to more residents, I live over in the Triangle, and so then there's going to be questions about where is my bus? How far do I have to walk to the bus?
But theoretically, the Triangle wouldn't be in the assessment district and you wouldn't pay.
conceivably, right, unless we expand it and we're talking about all
Right.
residents, right? And so we could be opening something up. We're thinking about spreading equity, we could be spreading the definition of who gets a say, right, and who wants this service. So I think we just have to be mindful of that as we move forward. I'm interested in hearing more about the zones and what that would look like in terms of like kind of tiered pricing for the different zones. I think that's a good idea. I'm a little bit wary about kind of the contracting because it introduces that same problem, right, of people having higher expectations and really being pulled in a bunch of different directions when what you're trying to get to is a kind of fairness. And so I'm not sure how that would work.
Well, I'll just say that I agree in concept with most of with really everything that Joe says, but on the other hand, I also, I'm sure I voted for the AC transit tax, even though we don't have AC transit out at Emeryville, because I basically think we need, a transit system in Alameda County, and I don't object personally to paying for that tax, even though we don't have AC transit, and I personally would be fine with paying for it. I take the Emery Grand. I've always said that I would be more than happy to, if there was a convenient way for them to collect fares, I'd be more than happy to pay a fare whenever I took it. My only concern is I actually don't really know what the percentage is. Joe thinks 3 to 5%. I don't know if that's true. I don't know what the percentage is of people who are taking it. I'm pretty sure that 2,500 people aren't taking it every day, because then I think we need considerably more buses. My only concern is, will the people who are not taking it view it in the same way that I do, that we need to have a transit system and be willing to pay it? Maybe they wouldn't, maybe they wouldn't. I'm not sure. I do know a number of people who showed up at the meetings, at the city council meeting, said that they had never taken it. Some of them said they'd never taken it, or they almost never take it. But they think that we do need a transit system there. So I would be willing to give it a try.
Karen? So the residents have the power of the vote, and they elect the city council. Maybe, look, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, there isn't any sort of hidden agenda here, but we've talked about some places, some sources of revenues that kind of the city controls. I mean, the hotel tax, maybe you can get AC. The county to give you more money, maybe you can get AC transit. Those are things that your elected officials and their staff can really work hard on. And maybe there's a way to say, as long as other people's money, that's sort of the governmental money, can cover a certain percentage of the TMA budget to reflect residential ridership, as long as that happens, it doesn't matter where it comes from. And then you as voters can say, you can prioritize them to work to get other people's money. Like if we can get Alameda County to pitch in for a couple buses, we've made our contribution, and if we don't, then it's general fund. I don't know what, but you have that power that's unique, and maybe there's a way to incentivize that power into a revenue stream?
Well, I'm not sure there's one answer to the revenue issue. I think I am trying to get some sense of perhaps a multi-strand approach. And, and some of these questions I think are legal. If there's no more categorical exemptions, there may be, some need, right? But then what that assessment is, of course, is somewhat based upon an engineer's report, sometimes based upon equity. Right now, residential units are paying, I think, just under $127 per year per unit. So that's about $10 a month. Whether that's whether in a renewal that would be the standard for all, is something that I couldn't say right now. But, just as there's been some discussion about relooking again about the mix between offices and retail, and maybe looking at zones. I think certainly kind of to the extent that residents, not only there's a desire to include them, but there may or may not be a mandate to include them. Certainly, what that assessment is something I think is a discussion, or would be part of a proposal.
Karen, just one second.
yes.
Just, if there is a residential push and everything else, like I think John said, was as residents, there would be let's say, in Waterloo, there would be an expectation for stopping at each of the corners,
You open things up.
right?
Well,
So, and the other issue is having a little, like making sure that all the buses have pull strings or, something that is residential friendly. Because remember, as you include residents, you include people who are not as mobile as your average business person and everything else. So there are other issues when you start assessing residents, and you're going to have residents with kids, packages, elderly, and, some kind of handicap or whatever. So there would be some expectations of the system on that. So that's the thing that you gotta, if you start pushing that way, that you gotta address.
Well, I certainly think governance, well, first of all, governance is one of the areas that a management plan has to address when you send it out to the parcel owners to vote. So to the extent that you're including groups that aren't included now, because, then the issue of governance certainly comes up through the PBID. But quite frankly, I think the issue of governance would come up if it's general fund money, or city council controlled money coming up. Certainly the city is unlikely to assume that there's not going to be some expectations for that as well. So I think governance is an issue that will have to be addressed in the future in ways that it's not been now too. And that's also been an issue within the TMA, is this issue of who gets to decide things like stops and routes and schedules and those kinds of things.
Well, I think that one of the things that is, we're talking sort of granular and what's fair, which is a complicated discussion, but the underlying thing is there has to be some general consensus that there's a greater good to be had by the Emery-go-round. And I certainly feel there's a greater good to be had by the Emery-go-round. If I had to parse it out based on the actual number of dollars that I personally spend on it, well, maybe it's not worth it. The amount of money that, other political conversations aside, I don't want the federal government to spend as much of my money on defense as they do. But, I don't, I vote and I make my decisions and whatever, if there is a greater good to be had by the Emery-go-round, then we can't all sit here and say, well, I need it to stop in front of my house at 8:04 because I need to get to BART by, 8:33, otherwise I missed my connection. We can't have that conversation, that's not appropriate. So either we say, I believe there's a greater good to be had and let's work out some of the fairness issues, or we all devolve into, I want this. And I think that's silly.
I'm a part of the dissident North Hollis business group that has been mentioned a bunch of times. And I can tell you that there is no member of that group who disagrees with that position, including Francis Collins.
I agree, I've been sitting in the room with him, I agree with you, that's correct.
Maybe that sounds like a note maybe to end this meeting. It's 11:30. And perhaps we can maybe look at more of I think last time there was a discussion about coming with kind of a package proposal, which I think was not quite ready then, particularly after talking with NBS and getting some more information. So perhaps.
When will the study be done?
This week.
Because it'd be really great to see that.
This week, and we're hoping to have a special board meeting next week to review it.
Yeah, well, that will be a public meeting.
And I think that there's multiple steps to getting to where we need to go. I mean, so to me, there's like the broad strategy. This is like the strategy. These are those strands or the strand. But to get to the point of, if it's going to be a general, through the general fund, which would be a TO, which could be, it's what does that look like in terms of real dollars? I mean, that I don't think we're quite there yet, because not only do we not have that study, but that study hasn't factored in development projections that we gave. So, that
those are little.
right. So
They're
that's what I'm
little
saying.
dollars.
So my point,
Let's be honest.
Jeff, let me finish, please. My point is that when you get to specific amounts that you're trying to generate, we're not there yet. But I think perhaps, and correct me if I'm wrong, boss, that we might be at a place where we can start thinking about what is the package, or what, you know, what does the strategy look like based upon what we know now. And once you have kind of some sense of that, really that's what then has to go to the city council, right? And then based upon that direction, you get more into, you know, the specifics.
Would you be kind enough to distribute the study?
Sure.
To the people on this committee? Thank you.
But I think, you know, we have some sense of the dollars based upon what was given out last time and what we're seeing today. You know, there's going to be.
And I just want to, the study really addresses kind of where we are now, what we're
I got
right
it.
now. So
Yeah.
future of anything would have to be
Well, it's gonna be
evaluated.
less
And
unless
exactly,
you cut
it would all be,
service.
exactly,
Sure, we're willing to lower it.
exactly.
Right, but I mean, it gives you a good sense of, you know, I mean, where, the renewal was done 10 years ago, right? So
Yeah.
this is a good sort of check-in to, okay, here's what we set up 10 years ago, what does it look like now? It gives us a sense of.
Is our 90% of the riders getting on at Every Dog Has Its Daycare? That's a.
Right.
They're not.
The only question is how many are going there
They're not.
with their dogs.
We'll have to allow dogs on the event too, huh?
Exactly.